I believe that being a software engineer is just like being a superhero. And with great power comes great responsibility. Now, coding is an integral part of being a software engineer. And just like estimates, brainstorming, making sure that we write unit tests and make sure that we are essentially creating robust and scalable solutions, writing clean code is also really important as a software engineer. And it's not really easy, especially if you don't have the experience or if you haven't researched enough for what the best practices are. Now, in this video, I'm going to teach you 8 different techniques that you can use in your daily JavaScript to write cleaner code. Hey everyone, I'm CodeWithAhsan and I'm a software architect and a Google developers expert. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe as it really helps the YouTube algorithm and it pushes the content out to every developer we are helping out. If you like the video at the end, make sure to press the thumbs up, and without further ado, let's get started. The first technique we are going to discuss is called pure functions or writing pure functions. And a pure function is a function that has always the same output given the same input. So it does not change anything outside of its scope, and it also does not depend on any outside variable that is not passed as an input. Let's check it out. So let's assume we have a variable that has a value here, and then we have a function that essentially uses the same variable and uses the split function on it and updates the variable. And then we essentially log this. So I'm going to just comment this out to show you the first example. So in this case, if I run this function, you see that we split the name with a space. So it splits it half from here, and then it gives us an array because the split function essentially returns an array. Now the problem with this approach is that this split name is not a pure function. And the reason is that it depends on an outside of this function's scope that makes it a bit dangerous, because this name variable will be changed and we wouldn't even know. And that means that this function might not give the same output given the same number of inputs. And right now it doesn't take any input. So every time it could be a different output. And it's really hard to test with such an approach. Now what we could do is that instead of relying on the global variable, we can essentially make this parameterized. So we are going to just say name string here, making it a parameter. So instead of updating this name variable here, we can simply do return name string.split and the same thing. Now you will see that here we are calling split name, which essentially just returns a value, so it doesn't update this variable. So what we can do here is that we can say something like name equals, and here we can pass this name. Now when we call this function with the value of name, it will pass Peter Parker string here, and then it will split it and return the result in this name variable. And if I just run this, you will see that the output is exactly the same. So we have not changed how it works, but essentially we have changed technically how the function is. And this function is now a pure function because it will always return the same output given the same input. For example, if I wanted to write a test out of it, what I would do is that I would just do a module.exports here, and then here I can simply say split name. Since I'm just passing this or exporting this, for example, the setup, you see that we import the index.js. So what we can do here is that here we can say first, this is a split name. And then here we essentially have something like const, and then we say split name equals index, because we already know that the index is a variable in this test environment. And then what we can do is that we can simply say expect, and here we can say split name. And let's say if I wanted to pass John Wick as the name here, then I would essentially expect the output to be an array of John Wick, which would have a John, and then here it would also have a string of Wick. Now I cannot use to be because this is an array, so I need to use to equal. And then if I just save this and try to run this, let's see what happens. Boom! Here you see that we got the test passing, which means that our function right now is 100% testable, which means that I can add multiple tests to this. I can add certain values and check what is the output when it comes to calling this split name function. And this is one of the really good benefits of using a pure function. Now let's actually take another example, which is a common mistake in JavaScript, which is this student's example. I'm actually going to comment out this console log here. So let's assume that we have an array, which is the student's array, and it already has Peter Parker here. Now let's suppose we got a function which essentially takes the student's array and it also has the new student. Now notice that when we call this function, it essentially uses the student's property or the student's parameter and pushes a new element into that array. Now the thing here is that that this is students, or if I just change it to, let's say, student array, this is exactly the same thing. Now, you might be thinking that, hey, this is fine. This looks like a pure function. But the problem here is that it is not using the global variable, but it's mutating the original array. And there are immutable and mutable objects in JavaScript, out of which arrays and objects are mutable, which means that they can be changed. So here we should not be pushing into the original array, because someone might be using this array within your code, and then if we change the original array, they might get a different result and they might get errors for that reason as well, or maybe the business logic is ruined overall. So what you need to do is that instead of pushing items to a past parameter, you always need to return an array from this function so you can assign it to your variable outside of it from where you're calling this. The way to do that would be, if I just run this first, let's see what is the output. You see that at index 0 we have Peter Parker, and then we have the Dr. Octavius here. Now you see that once I have called this function, it passes the students array, but then the students array is modified here, and now we cannot do anything. Now the suggestion that I was giving was essentially doing something like this. So we might just do return, and then we create a new array, and then we say something like students. So here we would have students array, and here we can just add the new student, and that's it. And now the responsibility of updating the array, or kind of assigning the array, would be of the function or the place where this function is being called from, which is exactly here on line number 13. So here, what I can do here is that I can say something like const, or if I just try to do this, let's see what happens. So if I just run this, you will see that we still have one item in Peter Parker, because now we are not updating anything. But if I wanted to update this, I would just do this. So students equals, and now you see that here we are updating this, or actually it says constant, yeah, because this should be a let. So if I run this again, let's see what happens. So here, after running, we see it working fine. Now the thing is that with this particular design pattern, or with this particular approach, you can always see where this array is being updated or where this array is being reassigned, because you would always try to find students equals, and you can be sure that, hey, here I'm actually assigning this or updating this from a new array. And now this is the same for if you wanted to filter out from an array or remove an item from the array itself. So instead of using, let's say, splice, which modifies the original array, you would be using something like a filter method, which essentially returns a new array. So I hope that this pure functions section makes sense to you. If it doesn't, let me know in the comments what you think about it, and if you have different opinions, and I would love to see those. Now the next thing that we need to discuss is object or array destructuring, and that is really handy in a lot of cases. So for this one, let's see an example. We have an object here, and you see that here we essentially have name, email, designation, and a loves property. And you see that here what we can do is that, let's say we extract a couple of variables out of this user or this object. So a traditional way would be to do something like this. We have a name variable, and then we are doing user.name. Similarly, email, user.email, loves, user.loves. Now this is okay, but we are creating a lot of variables out of it, and this is not really cool. Another good way of doing this would be to use object destructuring, and we can essentially do that by just saying const, and here we can say name, email, and loves, and here I can just say user, and this would be giving us the exact output. You can see the name here, then we have the email here, and then we have the loves property value here. So this is much easier. Let's talk about another example. We have a getDetails function here, which essentially returns an array. Now you can see that the first item here is a name, second one is an email, and then we have street, city, zip, which essentially are addresses. So if I wanted to get out this name, email, and all of these addresses, I could do something like this. You can see that here we are calling the getDetails function, which essentially gets us the username, user email, and user address. If we want to just log this, let's see what happens. So instead of this one, I'm just going to log username. Run this, you see that we got the username, JavaScript, we got user email, and then we got user address. And you can see that this address is essentially an array of everything that is remaining after the email and name, because we did it like this. This is array destructuring, where we are saying that, hey, whatever comes from here, take the first item as username, take the second item as a user email, and everything else which is remaining, take that in a third variable called user address, and that would be an array, which is exactly what's happening right now. Now, if I wanted to take out the name and split it into first name and last name, I could do something like this. So we got the user first name, user last name, because we are doing a username.split by space. So this would split this name by space, and then it would return an array. And we know that the first item of the array is the first name, and the last item or the second item is the last name. So we could do something like this. So we say user first name and then user last name. And if I just log it, let's see what happens. So here you see that once we log this, we have the first name, we have the last name, and then we have the rest of the things as they are. Now let's talk about the third technique, which is using fewer or named parameters in your functions. And the concept of this is really simple. You either need to have two or one parameter, or you create an object as a parameter. Because when you have a function like this, for example, create button, which takes a title, color, disable, padding, margin, border, shadow, there are a lot of parameters, right? And let's suppose this code does some crazy magic and then creates a button. In that particular case, when calling this function, you would have to know, or you would have to remember what exactly is the parameter based on the position. For example, the first one is title, the second one is color, the third one is disabled. What happens if I don't want to provide the disabled value? Should I use null? Should I use undefined? What would be the case in that case? So in this particular case, if I have to, let's say, provide shadow, I would essentially have to provide all of the parameters before I can provide shadow. And this is kind of cumbersome when you have a lot of parameters. So what you can do instead of this is that instead of this, you can use an object and then destructure it like this. So you could essentially do something like params, just like this, and then you can do something like const this equals params. This is one way of writing it, but another way of writing it is exactly what I did before, just like this. So you see that all of these properties right here are the ones that are going to be provided, and if I don't want to provide something, I'm just not going to provide it. So instead of all this, I can just simply create an object and then send the value. So I can say something like title, and then I can say John Wick, and then similarly I can say disabled true, and that's all I need to pass. I don't need to worry about where disabled is in terms of positioning. I could also, let's say, provide shadow. So shadow, let's say 2 pixel and something. Now if I run this, let's see what happens. So here you can see that we got the name, and then the other properties are undefined, but the properties that we passed, they are there. So the code can now utilize them without having to have a really weird kind of statement that we see every time we call this function. So I hope this one makes sense as well. Now let's talk about another one, and this is actually one of my favorites, and I say my favorites because this is the one that I point out in a lot of pull requests, and I basically send them to kind of requesting changes because I don't really want us to be finding out what a variable is or what a value is without having to kind of ask the developers. So let's assume we have some huge code, and then we have this code, and here we have set interval doing something with this value. Now anyone who's not familiar with the code would come here and would be like, what the hell is this? What number is this? What does it mean? So instead of writing this exactly, what we could do is that we could say something like const, and then we could say milliseconds, or we could say day in milliseconds. Here we could have something like 3600 multiply by 24 multiply by thousands, and here we can add a comment here, which is this value. So here we could say something like this, and now we use this variable here. Now notice changing this actually makes sense, and this makes it much more readable. We know that this interval is going to essentially execute in 1 day because that's the number of milliseconds that we have chosen for this one. So try not to hard code values like this one or this number. Similar example is something like this. So let's say we got a function that is create user, and it has a name, designation, and type parameter. In this case, we have just console logged it. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just run it. Don't worry about this center interval. It's not going to do anything. So here you see that we got the name, designation, and type. Now, when I'm calling this function, and if this is a code that I'm seeing for the first time, I would be like, hey, this makes sense. This looks like a name. This looks like a designation, but this type, one, what does it mean? Is it a regular user? Is it an employee? Is it an admin? What does one mean? So instead of doing this, what you should be doing is something like this. You could say something like, just create a constant maybe. So maybe you could say something like user types, and here we could have something like a regular employee. And here you can give this the type of 1. Now, when I try to use this, I can just use it just like this, user types.employee, and that makes much more sense. We know that the type of this user is a regular employee. It's not employee, it's regular employee. And then you might argue that, hey, this software architect, this could also come from, let's say, an array or an object of constants or something like that. And I would agree. Instead of hard coding values, we should have constants wherever we are using a constant that's going to be reused in the code a lot of times. So I hope that this one makes sense and resonates with you. Write in the comments if you have found similar things in your code or someone else's code, and if you have been able to point this out into the pull request as well. Now let's talk about another technique that would help write clean code, especially with JavaScript. Let's assume we have this situation where we created a variable called t, and let's assume that we are trying to create a user, and then we also have to specify the user's salary, which means that we would have to also specify the user's tax. Now this t essentially is the tax percentage. So let's say in the user's country, 25% tax is the tax that is applied on the salary. Now we have two users, JavaScript and Darin Mukarram, and now we are starting to kind of reassign this user's array by applying the map function. Inside this map function, we are obviously getting the user for each iteration, and then we start writing code, and then we write a lot of code, and finally we go at the end and we say that, hey, return the entire user, and then the text is essentially user.salary multiplied by t divided by 100. Now, what was the t again? No, I don't actually remember. And that would be the case when you use these small variables. What does it mean? Instead of defining small variables or shorthand variables, probably try to give the complete names like something like tax, percentage, and then when we do this, we essentially just go here and then maybe add that, or maybe just say tax factor instead of percentage, because we are dividing by 100 as well. So here we just go here and then we essentially say tax factor. Now this makes much more sense. So try not to use small variables like x, y, unless they are x, y coordinates, of course, or a or b, because it really makes it hard to see that code, review that code, and also maintain that code. The sixth technique that we are going to talk about is setting the default values for an object that you're creating. Now imagine that we have the same create button function, and inside here we are passing a lot of properties, and then we need to just make sure that if the user has not passed a value, we essentially assign a default value for that. For instance, you can see that here we basically pass all of these values, then we create an object. Here we just say that button.title equals to title. If the title is not available, we use an empty string. Similarly, the default color is going to be 333. The default value for disabled is false, and the padding is 0 by default. Now all of this is kind of old school because we have better ways of doing this. Now imagine that we have a config in which we are only passing the title and disabled. With this particular approach, this works, of course, because we are creating a new button and then we are logging it. So here is the output. You see the title, color, disabled, and you can see that we are only passing the title and disabled, but we are also getting the value of color and padding as well. Now, instead of doing all of this, what you could do and what would make much more sense is something like this. So instead of doing this, what we could do is that we could do something like return Object.assign, or we could use the spread operator as well. So we are going to first use this object and then we are going to use another parameter. So let's say we change the parameter from all of this. So I'm actually going to remove all of this, and then instead of all of this, we could just say something like a config, right? And what we had there was we had a color which was 333, then we got disabled false, the title was an empty string, and finally we had the padding set to 0, right? So these were the default values. Now what we are doing here is that we are saying that if the config contains a property which is already present here, it would update it and it would essentially return the updated values. But if the config does not have a property out of these ones, this will use the default value out of here. So if I run this, you will see that it will still have the same output. The padding is 0. We are not passing padding here. You can see that the disabled is true. The color is 333 by default, and you can change this to something like DC, DC, DC. And if I run this, you will see that now we're getting the default value out of it. So instead of kind of doing the dot notation, you could do this, or you could use the spread operator as I just said. So here you would do something like this, and then inside here you could do something like this, and then you got the config as well. So I'm just going to make it pretty just like this, and here we got the config. So with the spread operator, it would look something like this. So I'm going to just play enter and you see that the output is exactly the same. Now let's talk about the seventh technique, and this is using the method chaining, especially in the classes. So you might have seen things like Moment.js, and there are other libraries as well, which allows you to chain multiple functions using the dot notation. For example, here you might want to do something like, let's say if it was moment, we might do something like moment and then something like set hours, dot set minutes, dot set seconds. And the way that it works is essentially we are chaining the methods right here. So imagine that we have an example where we have a player class, and here we have something like a constructor, which essentially takes the name, score, and position, and then assigns that initially. Then we have three methods to update these three properties, like set name, set position, and set score. If I create a new player, I would have to by default use this sort of notation, which is kind of repetitive because I'm doing player.setScore, player.setName, player.setPosition, and all of these are actually adjacent because they are like to the very next line of each other. If I log the player right now, this is what we get. We get the position, score, and the name as well. Now, in order to allow the method chaining, now all we need to do to make this chainable is to essentially return the value this from every function we want to chain. So here I'm going to provide this here as well and here as well. And now what I can do here is I can simply say set score, and then I can say dot set name, and then I can say dot set position. Now if I do this and run this, see that we get the exact output, and this is sort of much cleaner because we know that we are applying all of these things onto the same object, the same player, or the same instance of this class. So this makes the code really clean and soothing to the eyes, at least mine. Now let's talk about the final and the eighth technique, and this is using promises over callbacks. We all know about the callback hell, that it's super weird and we want to avoid it at any cost, but sometimes we actually end up doing it anyways. So we are looking at an example right now on how this works. So for example, I have a main function called perform tasks, and this is sort of the callback hell. I essentially call the get user first, which essentially retrieves the user. Then we call the get designation. Once we receive the designation, then we call the get books. After we get the books, we get the socials, and then we log all of those when we get them. Now, if I run this, see what happens in the console. We first get the user, then we get the designation, then we get the books, and then we get the socials. Now, assume that all of this is done probably through an API, which means this is all async. That's why we are using callbacks, of course. So if each of this function used an API call, this is how the code would look. And if you had further use cases, for example, we have just 4 here. Let's say if you had 10 such cases for different reasons, it would become a hell to maintain to see which parameters go where. And we can actually avoid that by using promises. The code for this looks like this. You see that the perform tasks function calls all of these, and then the get user essentially calls the callback after the timeout. Similarly, we got designation, it does the same thing. The get books, it does the same thing, and then everything is essentially the same. Now, what we could do is that we can use promises instead of all this. So instead of this callback, I'm actually going to remove all of the callbacks because we are going to convert them into promises. So let's start with this one. We are going to essentially return a promise, and here we are going to say resolve, and this resolve essentially would have this block, and then inside we are going to run this, and then we are going to have just the resolve being called once we are done with the timeout. So we can simply say something like resolve, and here we are calling that. Now, once we have this kind of converted into a promise, I can actually go and change the other ones as well. So here we are just going to change the output or the data that it is passing. So I'm going to replace this one, and then I'm going to use the same functions for the other ones as well. Alright, now that we have converted all our functions to promises, what we can do now is instead of this callback hell, we can use promises. So we can do something like this. We can say get user, and then we essentially say then. And then in this then, we are going to retrieve the user itself. So here we are going to essentially use this. So I'm going to do this, and then we have this console log. So I'm just going to copy this. And then from this one, we are going to return get designation. Then we are going to just copy paste this then block a couple of times for the other functions, and we are going to just change what they're calling. So first one is user, second one is the designation. So we are going to use the designation here. Then this will call the get books, and then we are going to get the books here. we're going to say books and kind of show the books here. And then finally we use the socials. So we are going to say socials, and then we have one more then block here. And then here we can just log this out. Finally, socials retrieved. So here I'm going to use this socials and this, and now I can comment this callback hell right here and see how this looks. Now you can see that here we essentially have a really nice structure to what's happening. We start with the get user method, then we call get designation, then we call get books, then we get socials, and finally we just console log the social. No need to return anything. Now if I run this, let's see what happens. I'm going to clean this. All right, so we get an error which is undefined, not a promise. All right, and the reason is that we are not returning a new promise, so we need to return a new promise from every function. So let's just quickly do that. And now if I run this after clearing this should work. So now you see that we first get the user, then we get the designation, then we get the books, and then we get the socials. Now you see that the code is much better than this callback hell because it's really hard to read, and this one is a bit easier. But now with async await, this is much better as well. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to copy this one since this is promises, and I'm going to convert this function into an async function. And then I can use the await statement for all of these calls, which would make it really easy to read. So I can do something like const, and I can say user, and then here I can say await get user. Then I can just log this just like this, and then I'm going to just copy and paste it a couple of times. So first time we are getting the user, second time we get the designation from the get designation method. Then we say designation retrieved, designation. Then we got the books, so we call the get books method. And then finally we got the get socials method. Here we are going to say books. We are going to say books retrieved, and then books. And then finally we got socials, and we say socials retrieved, and here socials. Now, if I remove all of this, look at this code. This is much easier to read, and I can actually have a little bit of space, which would also further enhance how this looks. So we essentially use the await get user, then we get the users, and everything is going to be exactly the same. So now if I try to run this function, let's see what happens. Fingers crossed. So here, now you see that it's working exactly the same, but with so much better readability for the code itself. Now you see that the async await statements look like everything is synchronous, but it's not. Everything is asynchronous. It's using promises, and it's using the async await API combined together to give us a really good code syntax, and it's doing all the magic behind the scenes with these promises. So now you see that this looks much better. We can know that what's happening in the entire process. We first get the user, then we get the designation, then we get the books, and then we get the socials. So I hope that you start using promises instead of callbacks, because even with the APIs that I use in my projects, which are callback based, I try to convert them into promise because they make sense and they make the code much more readable. So there you go, 8 techniques to help you write great JavaScript code. Alright, so I hope that you liked the video. If you did, press the thumbs up button. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already, as it really helps the channel grow. If you're interested in learning the MERN stack, which is MongoDB, Express.js, Node.js, and React in just 8 hours, you can watch this video, which is a crash course I uploaded recently, and hope you will learn a lot from it. I stream on Twitch and YouTube every Wednesday and Saturday, so feel free to chime in. I'm taking a vacation right now, but I'm gonna be back at it really soon. If you have not joined the Discord community, you're missing out a lot. Join it, connect with a lot of developers, ask questions, and you can also help out others and mentor them as well. With that said, I wish you a happy new year, and I wish that this year becomes the best year of your life, especially about your career as well. Having said that, happy coding, and I'm gonna see you in the next video.